For 31 years, Judge Harold Bellamy kept a single manila folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, the one case out of 9,000 that never let him sleep all the way through the night. He was 74 years old, 6 years off the bench, alone in a farmhouse outside Hadley, when the phone rang at 11 minutes past midnight, and a dying man's voice told him the boy had been innocent the whole time. Harold was not asleep. He almost never was. Not before 2 in the morning, not since Eleanor passed. He sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold and the radio off, listening to the house tick and settle the way old houses do. The phone on the wall still had a cord. Marcus had bought him a cell phone 2 Christmases ago, and it sat in a drawer with the battery dead, because Harold did not see the point of carrying a telephone in his pocket when nobody called him anyway. When the wall phone rang, he flinched. A call after midnight is never good news. He had learned that in 40 years of being a man people leaned on. He set the coffee down and crossed the cold linoleum in his socks and lifted the receiver. "Bellamy," he said. It was how he had answered for half a century. There was breathing on the line, wet, slow breathing, the kind that takes work. Then a voice, thin and scraped down to almost nothing. "Judge, it's Earl Mathers." Harold stood very still. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in years. Earl Mathers had been the county fire marshal back when Harold was still a young judge with dark hair and a steady hand. Earl would be near 80 now. "Earl?" Harold said carefully. "It's late." "I know what time it is." A cough, long and tearing, and Harold waited it out. "I'm dying, Judge. Lungs. They give me maybe a few weeks. I'm calling because I can't carry it any further." "Carry what, Earl?" "The Reese boy." And there it was. The name dropped into the quiet kitchen like a stone into a well, and Harold felt the cold come up through the floor and into his chest. Daniel Reese, 19 years old in the spring of 1992, the boy Harold had sentenced to life without parole for setting the fire that burned down the Ferris feed mill and killed the night watchman. A man named Otis Pruitt, who had 3 grandchildren and a bad hip and never woke up. "What about him?" Harold said. His voice came out lower than he meant it to. "He didn't do it." Earl's breath rattled. "He never did it, Judge. And I helped them put him away. God forgive me, I knew it then and I knew it every day since." Harold lowered himself into the kitchen chair by the phone, the one Eleanor used to sit in to talk to her sister. His knees did not ask his permission anymore. He had doubted that case for 31 years. He had carried the doubt the way a man carries a stone in his boot, learning to limp around it, never quite getting it out. And now an old dying man was telling him the doubt had a name and a shape and a paper trail. "Earl," he said, "tell me everything. Slow. Start at the beginning." "Not on the phone," another cough. "Come see me. Mercy General, 3rd floor, room 314. Come tomorrow, Judge. I might not have many tomorrows left, and there's a girl who needs to know. Daniel's girl. She's been writing letters for years. Nobody answers them." The line went dead before Harold could say another word. He sat there with the receiver against his ear, listening to the dial tone, until the recording came on and told him to please hang up and try again. He set it back in the cradle. His hand was not steady. Not from anger, from something that sat deeper in his stomach and would not leave. Outside, the wind moved through the bare pecan tree Eleanor had planted the year Marcus was born. Harold looked at the dark window and saw an old man looking back, and for the first time in a long time, he did not look away. To understand why that phone call landed the way it did, you have to understand the man who answered it. And you have to go back further than 1992. You have to go back to a boy named Harold Bellamy, who grew up poor in the hill country of Caldwell County, Tennessee, the son of a tobacco farmer who could not read his own name on a deed. Harold was the first in his family to finish high school. He worked nights at a sawmill and days for a country lawyer named Asa Crane, sweeping the office and filing papers, and old Asa took a liking to the quiet boy who asked good questions. Asa loaned him the money for college, then law school in Knoxville, and never once let Harold thank him out loud because Asa said gratitude was best paid forward, not back. Harold remembered that his whole life. He came back to Hadley because he believed the town deserved a judge who knew its names, who had pumped its gas and sat in its church pews and buried its dead. He married Eleanor Hodge in 1971, a school teacher with a laugh you could hear across a church social. They had one son, Marcus, born in 1977. Harold took the bench in 1981, 35 years old, the youngest circuit judge the county had ever seated, and he wore the robe like a vow. He believed in the law the way some men believe in scripture, not because it was perfect, because it was the best fence human beings had ever built against their own cruelty. An offense is only as good as the men who keep it standing. For 38 years, he kept it standing. He sent men to prison, and it cost him sleep. He gave men second chances and watched some of them waste it, and some of them become deacons and fathers and good neighbors. He learned the weight of a gavel is not in the wood. It is in the silence after it falls, when a family on one side of the room exhales and a family on the other side breaks. Eleanor used to say Harold carried every case home in his coat pocket. She would brush his shoulders at the door like she was brushing off the day, a little ritual, and he would let her, because it helped. After she died, there was no one to brush off his shoulders, and the days started to pile up on him, and one case sat heavier than all the rest. The Ferris Fire. It happened in April of 1992. The feed mill on the edge of town, a big wooden structure that had stood since before the war, went up in the middle of the night so fast and so hot that by the time the trucks got there was nothing to do but keep it from spreading. Inside, they found Otis Pruitt, 63, the night watchman, dead of smoke before the flames ever reached him. The town grieved hard. Otis had walked half the children in Hadley to school across the highway when he worked the crossing, before his hip went bad. People wanted someone to pay. The someone was Daniel Reese. 19 years old, a hired hand who had drifted into the county the autumn before, slept in a room above the hardware store, did day labor for anyone who would pay cash. He had worked 3 weeks at the Ferris mill loading sacks, and Gerald Ferris, the owner's son, had fired him for showing up late. The prosecution said Daniel set the fire out of spite. They had a witness who put a young man near the mill that night. They had a can of kerosene from the hardware store with Daniel's prints, though Daniel bought kerosene every week for the lamp in his rented room because the wiring up there did not reach the back wall. They had a boy with no money, no family, no lawyer worth the name, and a whole county that needed the fire to have a face. The district attorney was a man named Wendell Prescott. Harold remembered him clearly. Prescott was ambitious in a way that did not bother to hide itself. He wore good suits in a town of work shirts, and he tried cases like he was running for something, which he was always. Prescott built the Reese case fast and clean and pressed it hard, and the jury came back in under 3 hours. Harold had presided. The law gave him no room on the verdict, only on the sentence, and the statute on felony murder with a death gave him almost no room there either. He sentenced Daniel Reese to life without parole. The boy did not cry. He stood there in a borrowed jacket 2 sizes too big and looked at Harold with eyes that were not angry, only lost, and he said one thing before the bailiff took him out. "I didn't do it, Your Honor. I know nobody believes me, but I didn't." Defendants say that. They say it all the time, and most of them are lying, and a judge learns not to let it in. But something in the Reese case never sat right with Harold, and it never sat right because of one small thing the trial barely touched: the burn pattern. Harold had grown up around fire the way country people do, brush fires and barn fires and the controlled burns his father set in the tobacco rows. He knew how fire moved. And in the photographs the prosecution put into evidence, the char on the mill floor spread out from 2 points, not one. 2 separate origins, on opposite ends of the building. A boy with a grudge and a can of kerosene sets one fire. He does not like 2, 50 feet apart, in a building he is trying to flee. 2 points of origin meant the fire was meant to be thorough, meant to be sure. That was not spite. That was a plan. Harold had asked the fire marshal about it on the stand, Earl Mathers, and Earl had stood there in his good clothes and said the second char pattern was probably from a fuel drum that ruptured in the heat. Secondary, nothing to it. He said it without looking up. Harold remembered that now, sitting in his cold kitchen at 1 in the morning. Earl Mathers had not looked up. There had been other small things, too, the kind a judge files away without quite meaning to. The way Prescott rushed it all, 3 weeks from arrest to verdict, fast even for a small county. The way the public defender, a tired man named Briggs who carried 200 cases and a flask, never once put the burn pattern to the jury. The way the courtroom that spring had been so full and so angry, the whole town packed into the pews wanting a face for their grief, that the air itself seemed to lean on the verdict. Harold had told himself then that a full courtroom was justice working, the community present at its own reckoning. He understood now it had been the opposite. A frightened town is not a jury. It is a mob that has agreed to sit down and behave, and the only thing between the two is a judge willing to slow it all down and ask the hard, quiet question out loud. Harold had asked it once, of Earl Mathers, and taken the first answer, because the first answer let everyone go home. The next morning, Harold dug the cell phone out of the drawer, found the charger, and sat at the kitchen table while it came alive. He was not a man who liked machines, but he was a man who finished what he started. And Earl Mathers had handed him something he could not put back down. He drove the 40 minutes to Mercy General with his old county map on the seat beside him out of habit, though he knew the way. The hospital smelled like every hospital, like bleach trying to cover something it could not. He took the elevator to the third floor and found room 314, and he stood outside the door for a long moment, the way he used to stand outside the chamber's door before walking into a courtroom, gathering himself. Earl Mathers was a skeleton with skin. The cancer had eaten him down to almost nothing. There were tubes in his nose and an IV in the back of his spotted hand, and a machine beside the bed counted his heart out loud. But his eyes were clear, and when he saw Harold in the doorway, something in his face loosened, the way a man's face loosens when he has been waiting a long time, and the wait is finally over. "You came," Earl said. "I came." Harold pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. "Now tell me, Earl, all of it." And Earl told him. The second point of origin was no fuel drum. Earl had known it the night he walked the scene. 2 pours of accelerant, deliberate, at opposite ends. The signature of a man who wanted the building gone and was not trusting it to chance. Earl had written it up that way in his first field report. 2 origins, intentional, professional. He had the report typed and signed and in the file by the end of that first week. Then Wendell Prescott came to see him. "He sat in my office," Earl said, his voice failing and catching like an old engine. "Told me the Reese boy was good for it. Told me the town needed it closed before the funeral. And he told me the second origin finding muddied the water, made it look like more than one man, made it look planned, and a planned mill fire pointed somewhere I didn't want to point." Earl's eyes went to the ceiling, because the somewhere it pointed was Gerald Ferris. Harold sat very still, the owner's son. "The mill was failing, Judge. Old man Ferris was sick and the books were drowning. There was a big insurance policy, and Gerald collected on it inside 90 days. Bought himself a car dealership over in 2 counties with the money, and never looked back." Earl coughed, and Harold gave him water from the cup on the tray, holding the straw to his cracked lips. Prescott knew. He had to know. But Gerald's daddy had money and a name, and a Ferris on trial would have buried Prescott's career before it started. A drifter with no people now, that boy could be spent. Nobody was going to come asking. "So you changed the report?" "I wrote a second one. Single origin, accidental flashover spread, consistent with the prosecution's timeline. Filed it over the first. The first one disappeared." Earl turned his head, and the tears ran sideways across his face into the pillow. "And there was a girl. There was a witness Prescott buried." Harold leaned in. "What girl?" "Ruby Coyle. She was 16. Lived in the trailer park down past the mill. She came to the sheriff 3 days after the fire and said she saw a truck behind the mill that night, near midnight, and a man unloading cans from the bed. And it wasn't the Reese boy. It was a green dually with a chrome toolbox, and there was only one green dually in this county, and it belonged to Gerald Ferris." Earl's chest heaved. "She gave a statement, signed it, and Prescott had it walked out of the file. Told the sheriff the girl was confused, that she had a reputation, that her stepdaddy ran shine, and she'd say anything for attention. 16 years old, Judge. They made her out a liar, and she never said another word about it. Far as I know, she's still around. Married now. Coyle was her maiden name." Harold's hands were folded on the edge of the bed, and he looked down at them. The big knuckles, the liver spots, the wedding band he still wore, 3 years a widower. These were the hands that had signed the order. These were the hands that had set Daniel Reese's whole life on fire as surely as somebody set that mill alight. "Why are you telling me now?" Harold said quietly. "After all this time?" Earl was a while answering. The machine beeped. Outside in the hall, a cart rolled by. "Because you doubted it," Earl said finally. "You're the only one in that whole courtroom who looked at those photos and saw two fires. I watched you see it, and I watched you let it go because I lied to you on that stand. I lied to a good judge, and I've thought about your face every day for 31 years. He found Harold's hand with his cold fingers, thin as kindling. "I can't undo what I did, but I can hand it to the one man who might. There's a box, Judge, under my bed at the house. My sister has the key. The first report's in it. I kept a copy. I knew someday I'd need it to be true." Harold drove home with the radio off and his hands at 10 and 2 like a young man taking his test. The county rolled past the window, the same hills, the same churches, the same diner with the sign that still said open, even though they had cut the hours down to breakfast and lunch. He had been a judge in this county for 38 years, and he had thought he knew its weight. He had not. There was a man in a prison cell 200 miles away who had been 19 and was now 50, who had spent every season of his manhood behind concrete for a fire he did not light. And the man who had built the lie was not in prison. The man who built the lie was the Honorable Wendell Prescott, retired Justice of the State Supreme Court, with his portrait hanging in the marble lobby of the courthouse in the Capitol, and an honorary degree and a wing of the law library named for his late wife. Harold pulled the truck over on the shoulder of the county road, put it in park, and sat there a long while with the engine ticking. He thought about how easy it would be to let it stay buried. He was an old man. Earl Mathers was dying and would be dead before any of this saw daylight, and a dying man's confession is a thin thread to hang a Supreme Court justice on. Marcus would tell him to leave it alone. Marcus told him to leave most things alone. His son had become a man who measured every choice by what it cost, and a man like that would look at this and see only the cost. But Harold kept hearing the boy. "I didn't do it, Your Honor." "I know nobody believes me." Somebody had believed him. Harold had believed him in the one quiet corner of himself he never let speak, and he had let the gavel fall anyway because the law gave him no room and the fire marshal looked him in the eye and lied. The law had been his fence against cruelty his whole life, and cruelty had climbed right over it, wearing a good suit, and Harold had held the gate. He put the truck in gear and drove, not home, but to the public library in Hadley, where a girl at the desk who was young enough to be his great-granddaughter helped him find the number for the state legal aid office, and where, after an hour of being passed from line to line, a voice picked up that would change everything. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 31 years old, 3 years out of law school, and she worked for the Innocence Project of the South out of a cramped office in the Capitol with 2 desks and a coffee maker that only worked if you hit it. She had taken the call because nobody else was in, and she had nearly cut him off twice because old men called the office all the time swearing the world had wronged them. But there was something in the way the old man talked. Flat, careful, no heat in it. He gave her dates and docket numbers from memory. He said he was the judge who had sentenced the man, and then he said a sentence that made Ruth Calloway sit up and reach for a pen. "I am calling to tell you I made a mistake," Harold said, "and I have spent 31 years too proud and too tired to fix it, and I am out of both now, and I would like your help to fix it before I die." Ruth drove out to Hadley that Saturday. She found a farmhouse with a sagging porch and a pecan tree and an old man who met her at the door in a pressed shirt with the collar buttoned, because that was how Harold Bellamy received people, even strangers, even now. He had coffee made. He had the kitchen table cleared and a legal pad squared on it. And beside the legal pad was a manila folder, soft and gray at the edges, from 31 years of being taken out and put back. They worked. Harold laid it out the way he would have laid out a charge to a jury, in order, without varnish. The 2 points of origin, Earl Mathers on the stand, the kerosene that meant nothing, the witness who was made a liar. Ruth listened and asked the sharp, short questions of someone who had learned to be careful with hope. And slowly, across that kitchen table, her caution wore down to something else. She had read about cases like this. She had never sat across from the judge who signed one and watched him fold his big hands and say, "This one is mine. I did this. Help me undo it." Judge, she said carefully near the end of the day, you understand what this is. Wendell Prescott isn't just anybody. He's got friends on every bench in this state. People owe him their careers. If we file, they'll come for you. They'll say you're a confused old man with a guilty conscience trying to rewrite his own record. They'll dig up everything. And it could take years. You might not see the end of it. Harold looked at her across the table. Outside, the late afternoon light was going gold over the hill country. Miss Calloway, he said, I sat on a bench for 38 years, and I told myself the law was a fence against the worst in us. I found out it's only a fence if somebody's willing to stand at the gate and take the weather. I've got no career left to lose and no time left to waste being afraid. Let them come. Ruth Calloway closed her notebook, and she did not say it out loud, but she decided right there at that kitchen table that she would not lose this one. Some cases you take, some cases take you. The box came first. Earl Mather's sister was a tight-mouthed woman named Verna, who lived alone with a dog and did not want a stranger in her brother's house. But Harold knew her people, knew her late husband had farmed the bottom land off Route 9, and he sat on her porch and talked about nothing for half an hour, the way country people do before they get to the thing. And by the end, she fetched the key and led him to the back bedroom and pulled a fishing tackle box from under the bed. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bread bag against the damp, was the original 1992 Fire Marshal's Field Report. Earl Mathers' signature at the bottom, dated 4 days after the fire. 2 points of origin. Deliberate accelerant pour, both ends. Inconsistent with a single actor flashover. Recommend arson investigation, primary suspect determination pending. And, clipped to it, a Polaroid Earl had taken himself, the char on the floor radiating from 2 black star-shaped scorches at opposite ends of the frame, exactly as Harold had seen them in the courtroom, and exactly as the second, doctored report had explained away. Harold held the bread bag in both hands in the dim back bedroom, and his eyes stung. Not the report, the Polaroid. The proof had existed the whole time. It had sat in a tackle box under a dying man's bed for 31 years, true the entire time, waiting for one person to be brave enough to need it. Then they went looking for Ruby Coyle. She was Ruby Vance now, 51 years old, married to a long-haul trucker, 2 grown sons, a small brick house on the edge of a town 3 counties over with a vegetable garden out back and a wind chime made of old spoons. Ruth Calloway knocked, and a woman with gray coming into her hair opened the door, and when Ruth said the words, Ferris Mill Fire, the woman's face went white as paper, and she put her hand on the doorframe to hold herself up. I waited 31 years for somebody to knock on that door, Ruby said. She let them in. She made sweet tea with shaking hands. And then she told the same story Earl Mathers had told, from the other end of it. The green dually, the chrome toolbox, the cans coming off the bed at midnight, the man's shape she had known because everybody knew Gerald Ferris's truck, and then the sheriff calling her a liar, and her stepfather telling her to keep her mouth shut before the law looked too close at his own business, and a whole town deciding she was trash who made things up, until she half believed it herself. They told me a man was going to prison because of what I saw, Ruby said, twisting a paper napkin to shreds. And then they told me I never saw it. I was 16. What does a 16-year-old do? I shut up. I prayed for that Reese boy every night for years, and I never once said his name out loud. She looked at Harold. You're the judge. You're the one that sent him. Yes, Harold said. He did not look away. He had decided he was done looking away. I am. Ruby studied him a long moment. You come to make it right? I come to try. She nodded slowly, and something hard in her face eased. Then I'll say it as many times as you need me to. In a courtroom, to a camera, to God. I'm done being scared of the Ferrises. They needed the old court records, and that is where the silent helper came in. The way one always seems to in stories like this, not with a speech, but with a key. His name was Hank Dooley. He had been the bailiff in Harold's courtroom for 26 years, a wide, quiet man who never said 3 words where one would do. And he was retired now and kept bees out past the fairgrounds. Harold drove out to see him because the trial transcript and the exhibit log had been boxed and sent to the county archive years ago. And the county archive had flooded twice since, and half of what should have been there was not. Without the original exhibit log, Prescott's lawyers would say the doctored report had always been the only report, that Earl Mathers was inventing a first one from a deathbed haze. Hank listened to the whole thing standing in his bee yard in a veil and gloves, not saying anything, working the frames. When Harold finished, Hank set the smoker down. "You want to come up to the house?" he said. "Have you eaten?" He did not ask what happened. He fed Harold cornbread and beans at a kitchen table, and only when the plates were clean did he go to a closet and bring out a cardboard box, soft with age, and set it down without a word. Inside were Hank Dooley's own bailiff logs, 26 years of them, in a careful, blocky hand. A bailiff logs every exhibit that comes into a courtroom and everyone that leaves, because chain of custody is his job, and his name is on it. And in the spring of 1992, Hank Dooley had logged in 2 fire marshal reports on 2 different dates and logged one of them back out 3 days later into the hands of the district attorney's office, and never seen it again. "I logged it," Hank said. "Always wondered why a man needs to take a report back out of evidence. Wrote down the date anyhow. Figured someday somebody'd want to know." He looked at Harold a long moment. "Took you long enough, Judge." "It did," Harold said. "Well," Hank started clearing the plates, "you're here now." That was all he said about it. But the bailiff's log, dated and signed in a hand no jury could doubt, was the hinge the whole case turned on. The cold proof that a second report had existed and been carried away. A quiet man with a habit of writing things down had kept the truth alive in a cardboard box for 31 years and never once mentioned it to a soul, because nobody had ever thought to ask. There was a girl, too. Earl had said it on the phone, Daniel's girl. Her name was Nora Reese, and she was 29 years old, which meant she had been born after her father went to prison, conceived in the few weeks before his arrest with a girl Daniel had been seeing, a girl who married someone else and never told Daniel he had a daughter until Nora was old enough to ask. Nora had found out at 15, and at 16 she had ridden a Greyhound bus 200 miles to a state prison and sat across a scarred table from a stranger in a jumpsuit, who had her chin and her hands, and she had been visiting him ever since. She was the one who had written the letters, years of them, to lawyers, to journalists, to anybody she could find an address for, in a careful hand, with the docket number always at the top, begging somebody to look. Nobody had answered. Lawyers do not answer letters from the daughters of convicted murderers. There is no money in it, and no glory, and 1,000 of them come in for everyone that's true. When Ruth Calloway called Nora and said she had read her father's case and believed he was innocent and had the proof, there was a silence on the line so long Ruth thought the call had dropped. Then a sound, small and broken, that took Ruth a second to recognize as a grown woman crying, with her hand over her mouth so the neighbors would not hear. They went to the prison together, the 4 of them, on a gray Tuesday morning in the fall. Harold had been to that prison before, years ago. Official visits, the warden's office, the antiseptic smell, and the doors that lock behind you with a sound like a judgment. This time he came as a man, not a judge. They were not allowed in together. Nora went in first, then Ruth, the lawyer, and then, after a long wait in a plastic chair under fluorescent light, they let Harold Bellamy walk into the visiting room to meet the man he had sentenced 31 years before. Daniel Reese was 50 years old. His hair had gone gray and thin, and he wore it cropped close. He was thin the way men get inside, all wire and no softness, and his hands, when he set them on the table, were a working man's hands that had not done a day of free work in 3 decades. He looked at Harold across the table, and Harold looked back, and for a moment, neither one of them could find a word in the whole language that would hold what was in the room. "I remember you," Daniel said finally. His voice was rough from disuse and from cigarettes he must have bought with what little he had. "You had dark hair then." "I did," Harold said. "You're the one said life without." "I am." Harold's throat tightened until he could not swallow. "I read the verdict and I passed the sentence the law gave me. And I want you to hear me say I knew. Some part of me knew the fire wasn't right, and I let it go, and you paid for what I let go. I am not here to ask you to forgive me. I have no right to that. I am here to tell you I am going to spend whatever I have left getting you out of this place, and that the man who answered the phone is not the same man who held that gavel, because the man who held that gavel could live with himself, and I cannot do that anymore." Daniel Reese was quiet for a long time, His jaw worked, his eyes were wet, and he did not wipe them, because a man inside learns not to show his hands what his face is doing. "You know what I missed," Daniel said. "Everybody asks what I missed. Cars, beaches, women. It ain't that." He looked at the door Nora had gone out of. "I missed her growing up. I found out I had a daughter when she walked into this room at 16 years old with my own face on her, and I'd already missed all of it. First steps, school. I missed being a man who could keep his girl safe. That's what they took. Not years. They took being a father." He looked back at Harold, and there was no hatred in him, only a tiredness that went down to the bone. "But she came. Every month she came. And now you came," he nodded slowly. "Awful late, Judge, but you came. Most folks never do." The motion Ruth Calloway filed ran to 200 pages, and it landed in the county court like a stone through a church window. A petition for post-conviction relief and a motion for a new trial, based on newly discovered evidence and prosecutorial misconduct in the matter of the State versus Daniel Reese, 1992. The original fire marshal's report, the recanted testimony of the fire marshal himself, sworn out in an affidavit at his hospital bedside 11 days before Earl Mathers died. The suppressed eyewitness statement of Ruby Coyle Vance, and her sworn willingness to testify. And at the front of it all, a thing no one in that courthouse had ever seen, an affidavit from the sentencing judge himself, the Honorable Harold Bellamy, retired, attesting that exculpatory evidence had been withheld from his court, and that, in his judgment after 31 years, the conviction of Daniel Reese was a miscarriage of justice he had unknowingly presided over. The town of Hadley had thought the Ferris fire was a closed book, a sad old story, the kind of thing the old-timers brought up at the barber shop when the talk turned to the bad spring of '92. They were wrong. The book was not closed. It had only been waiting for someone to turn the page. You could feel it move through the town. The diner on Main, the one that still says open even though the hours got cut to breakfast and lunch, filled up louder than it had in years. The old men at the counter, the ones who remembered '92, turned it over their coffee the way old men do. Some of them had sat on that jury. One of them, a retired mail carrier named George, who had carried the route past the Ferris mill for 38 years, set down his cup one morning and said to no one in particular, "I voted to convict that boy. I went home and slept fine. What does that make me?" Nobody answered him. There was no answer that would fit in a diner. And 200 miles away, in a tall house with a view of the river, the Honorable Wendell Prescott read the county paper that his clipping service still sent him, and his hand was not as steady as it had been. He made a phone call to a man who owed him, then another. He told himself it was the confusion of a senile old judge and a dying liar, told it to himself in the same confident voice he had used on a jury 31 years before. But a man knows. Deep down under all the practiced certainty, a man always knows which of his nights he is being asked to answer for. Prescott poured a drink he did not want and stood at the window a long time, watching the river go dark, the way Daniel Reese had once watched a barred window go dark in a cell. And for once in his long, careful life, the two of them were thinking about the very same fire. And Wendell Prescott came, just as Ruth had said he would. He did not come himself, not at first. He sent lawyers, good ones, expensive ones, who filed motions calling the petition baseless and Harold Bellamy a confused and grieving old man. They put it in the papers gently, the way powerful people do their cruelty, with sources close to the matter and longtime observers noting. A retired judge, recently widowed, isolated, perhaps not himself. A dying fire marshal's deathbed confession, unreliable by its nature. A so-called witness with a history. They tried to make the whole thing look like the sad confusion of three broken people, and for a few weeks, it almost worked, because that is how it usually works. What they did not count on was Harold Bellamy on a witness stand. The hearing was held in the same courthouse where the trial had been, the same high-ceilinged room with the same tall windows, though the bench was newer and the judge on it now was a careful woman named Patricia Hollings, who had clerked for Harold 30 years before and owed him nothing but the truth. Harold sat in the witness chair where Earl Mathers had once lied to him, and he raised his right hand, and he told it all. Slow, in order, without heat, the way he had taught 100 young lawyers to tell a story to a jury, so that the facts themselves carried the weight and the teller got out of the way. Prescott's lawyers came at him. They asked if he was on medication. They asked about Eleanor's death and his living alone and whether he saw his son. They asked, in a dozen polished ways, whether an old man at the end of his life might want to be a hero, might be inventing a great injustice to give his last year's meaning. And Harold, 74 years old, hands folded, answered every question in the same flat, steady voice. "I have asked myself all of that," he said at last, when the youngest of Prescott's lawyers pushed it one time too many. "Believe me, son, I have laid awake asking it, whether I want this to be true. And here's what I know. I did not want this to be true for 31 years. I wanted it buried so badly I helped bury it, by doing nothing, which is the quiet way good men do terrible things. The proof did not come to me because I went looking, brave and noble. It came to me because a dying man could not carry it to his grave, and it landed in my kitchen at midnight. And I could either pick it up or finish my life pretending I never heard the phone ring. I am too old to pretend anymore. That is the only reason any of us are in this room. Not because I want to be a hero, because I cannot stand to die a coward." The room was very quiet. Patricia Hollings looked down at her hands. The young lawyer sat back down. Then Ruby Vance took the stand and described a green dually and a chrome toolbox in a voice that did not shake. Not anymore. Then the fire investigator the Innocence Project had hired, a man with 30 years and a wall of credentials, walked the court through the 2 points of origin and said, plainly, that no honest investigator could have called that fire a single origin accident, and that whoever signed the second report either did not know his trade or knew it too well. Then they played a video deposition of Earl Mathers, gray and gasping in his hospital bed, taken 9 days before he died, in which he said the words once more for the record, with the date and the names, and asked the court and Daniel Reese to forgive an old man who had been afraid of the wrong things his whole life. By the time it was done, there was not a soul in that courtroom who believed Daniel Reese had set the Ferris fire. The county newspaper ran it across the front page. Judge reopens 1992 fire case. Evidence points to mill owner's son. Then the wire services picked it up, and then the cable news, because there is nothing the country loves like a story of an old judge undoing his own mistake. And Harold Bellamy, who had not wanted to be a hero, found himself one anyway, which is usually the only honest way it happens. Patricia Hollings vacated the conviction of Daniel Reese on a cold, bright morning in December. She ordered a new trial, and the new district attorney, looking at the same evidence Wendell Prescott had buried in 1992, declined to bring one. The charges were dismissed. After 31 years, 7 months, and 19 days, the doors of the prison opened, and Daniel Reese walked out into the free air, a man of 50, blinking in a sun he had not stood under in 3 decades, with his daughter's arms around his neck, and an old judge waiting by a pickup truck at the edge of the lot, hat in his hands. The reckoning for Wendell Prescott did not come with handcuffs in a courtroom, the way it does in stories. It came slower than that. It came worse. The state attorney general opened an investigation. The statute of limitations had long run out on the obstruction itself, the law's own cruelest joke, that a buried truth can outlive the punishment for burying it. But the Bar Association does not run on statutes. The disciplinary board took up the matter, and in the end, the Honorable Wendell Prescott, retired Justice of the State Supreme Court, was disbarred at the age of 79, his license to practice law revoked, his name removed from the law library wing, his portrait quietly taken down from the marble lobby of the Capitol Courthouse one night so there would be no photographers. The men who had owed him their careers stopped returning his calls, the way such men always do, because their loyalty was never to him, only to his usefulness. And a disgraced man is of no use. He died 18 months later in a house with the curtains drawn, and the obituary his family ran did not mention the law at all. Gerald Ferris had died years before, of a heart attack, on the lot of his car dealership, a fat and prosperous man who had gotten clean away with murder and insurance fraud and never spent a night worried about it. There is no court that could reach him now. But the truth reached him. The newspapers printed his name beside the word arson, and his children, who had inherited his money and his good name, learned what the money was made of. And that is a sentence of its own kind. To find out the floor you were standing on was built over a grave. There is a dark side to this, and and honest telling does not leave it out. Daniel Reese got out, but he did not get his life back. There is no order a judge can sign that returns 31 years. He was 50 years old with no work history, no driver's license, no savings, no social security to speak of. A man who had gone in at 19 and come out into a world of devices he did not understand, and prices that frightened him, and a body that had aged hard behind concrete. The state paid him a settlement, finally, after another 2 years of lawyers, and it was a large number, and it was nothing. You cannot price a childhood you missed seeing, a wedding you were not at because there was no wedding. The simple animal freedom of walking out a door in the morning because you feel like it. The money sat in an account, and Daniel barely touched it. He did not want a beach, he wanted the years, and those were not for sale. But here is the light, and it is real, and it is the part Harold thinks about now when he sits on his porch in the evening. Daniel Reese moved to Hadley. Of all the places on earth, he came to the town that had convicted him, and when people asked why, he said it was the only place his daughter's people were, and the only place where the man who got him free lived. And at 50 years old, he was done being far from the people who mattered. He bought a small house 2 streets over from Harold's farmhouse with a piece of the settlement, and he learned to fix small engines, lawnmowers, and chainsaws and outboard motors, because his hands were good and they needed to work, and he hung out a hand-painted sign, and the people of Hadley, who had once needed his face to be the fire, now brought him their broken things to mend, which is a town's clumsy way of asking forgiveness. Nora moved her family close. Daniel learned to be a grandfather, since he had missed being a father, and he turned out to have a gift for it. The patience of a man who has learned the hard way what time is worth. He taught his grandson to fish off the same bottomland bridge where Verna Mather's husband used to farm. He went to a small church on the edge of town with a hand-painted sign, the Lutheran one, and sat in the back. And after a while, he sat closer to the front. And on Sunday afternoons, more often than not, an old man in a pressed shirt with the collar buttoned would walk the 2 streets over, slow, with a cane now, because the knees had finally won. Daniel would have coffee ready. They did not talk about the fire much. They had said all of that. They talked about engines and weather, and Nora's boy and the Braves, the way 2 old men talk. And sometimes they did not talk at all, just sat on the porch and watched the light go gold over the hills. And that silence was the most forgiveness either of them knew how to give or to take. Harold's son Marcus came home for the first time in 4 years that next summer. He had read about it all in the papers like everyone else, his own father's name on the news, and something in him that had been measuring everything by what it cost had finally run up against a thing that could not be measured that way. He came to the farmhouse and he stood in the kitchen, where the phone still hung on the wall with its cord, and he said, "Dad, you could have gotten hurt. You could have lost everything. Why did you do it?" And Harold, who had asked himself the same thing 100 times, gave his son the truest answer he had. "Because the phone rang," he said, "and I was the only one left who could hear what it was saying. A man spends his whole life building a fence against the worst in people, Marcus, and then one night he finds out the fence has a hole in it that he put there himself. You don't get to pretend you didn't see it just because you're tired. You don't get to die comfortable on top of a thing like that." He looked at his son, this man he had raised and somehow lost in plain sight. "Your mother used to brush off my shoulders at the door, every day, like she was brushing off whatever I carried home. There was one thing she could never brush off, and she knew it, and she never said a word, just let me carry it. I think she was waiting to see if I'd ever set it down right. I'm glad I did it before I followed her. I'd have hated to walk in and have to tell her I let it lie." Marcus did not have anything to say to that, but he stayed the week, and he came back at Thanksgiving, and he brought his own son the spring after, and the boy and Daniel Reese's grandson fished off the same bridge, 2 children who had no idea that the old men watching them from the bank had once stood on opposite sides of the worst day either had ever lived. Earl Mathers was buried in the cemetery behind the Lutheran church, and Harold paid for the stone, and at the funeral, which almost no one came to, Harold stood at the graveside and said a few words for a man most of the town remembered, if at all, as the fire marshal who got old and sick. He said Earl Mathers had been afraid most of his life, the way most men are, and that he had done a terrible thing out of that fear, and that at the very end, with nothing left to lose and nothing left to gain, He had done the bravest thing Harold ever saw a man do, which was to tell the truth when the truth could only cost him his peace. He said a man should not be measured only by his worst night, nor only by his best, but by which one he chooses when the choosing finally comes. And then they put Earl Mathers in the ground, and the truth he had carried for 31 years was lighter than the dirt they laid on him. The manila folder is not in the bottom drawer of Harold's desk anymore. There is nothing to keep in it. The case is over. Daniel Reese is free and fixing engines 2 streets over, and Ruby Vance sleeps through the night for the first time since she was 16. And Ruth Calloway took 3 more cases like it on the strength of the one she won. And somewhere in a quiet county, the truth that everyone thought was forgotten turned out only to have been waiting. The town changed, slow, the way a town does, one small thing at a time. The new district attorney started a review of every case Wendell Prescott had tried in Caldwell County, and 2 more men came home that no one had ever thought to doubt. The county put up a marker at the corner where the Ferris Mill had stood, a small bronze plaque, and on it was the name of Otis Pruitt, the night watchman who died. Because in all the years of pointing at the wrong man, the town had half forgotten the right one to grieve. George the mail carrier drove out to Daniel's little engine shop one Saturday, stood in the door a long time, and finally said he was one of the 12, and he was sorry. And Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Come on in out of the cold." And that was the end of it and the start of something. Ruth Calloway's 2-desk office got a 3rd desk and a phone that rang now. The Lutheran church took up a collection and bought Daniel his first set of new tools. And on the bridge over the bottom land, 2 boys who should never have met fished side by side in the long gold light, and neither of them would ever know how close the world had come to never letting them. Harold is 76 now. He sits on his porch in the evenings under the pecan tree Eleanor planted, with a cane against the rail and a cup of coffee going cold the way he likes it. The phone still hangs on the kitchen wall. It does not ring much. But Harold has made a kind of peace with the sound of it, because he learned, late, at the very end of a long life on the bench, the one thing all his years in the robe never taught him. A case is never truly closed, while one person still knows the truth and is brave enough to say it. And a man is never too old, and it is never too late, and the right thing does not stop being the right thing just because the doing of it costs you everything you have left. Some debts are paid in dollars. The heavy ones are paid in years, and the heaviest of all are paid the night you finally pick up the phone and answer for what you let lie in the dark, and choose, at last, to stand at the gate and take the weather.